So in this lesson, we're going to be going over the wrapper classes. Now, I briefly mentioned this in the previous video. A wrapper class, remember, is just a class that we can essentially wrap around the primitive data types. So if you recall, our primitive data types can only store the value itself that we have assigned to it. And it doesn't have any functions or methods or anything cool features we can do with it. It's literally just the value itself. So a wrapper class will, again, wrap around that primitive data type so we can have that data value associated with the variable, but it's also going to give us a few useful methods and functions that we can use to do things with that value also, or make new values, so on and so forth. So before we really dive into what a wrapper class looks like, we first need to understand a couple concepts. One of them is an immutable object. So what does immutable object mean? When we create a string or a different type of wrapper class, Java is going to take that variable that we created and it's going to store it in memory. An immutable object means that we can't change that value. So for instance, let's do a string here, okay? And if I type in a string, my string equals Adam, this is now essentially locked in memory for Java for essentially the life of the program or until garbage time collection happens, which that's beyond the scope of this beginning tutorial. So just know that essentially, realistically, that value is now always going to be assigned to this variable. So if I were to print this value right now, we would see that it's Adam. Obviously, we know we've seen that before. But now if I try and reassign this value, Adam 2, for instance, I said it's an immutable object. So realistically, we would, by that definition, we would think that I wouldn't be able to change this variable since it's quote unquote an immutable object. But we will see that I can change it. So what do I mean then by that's an immutable object? You can't change the value of the string. Well, like I said, when Java created this variable for us, it allocated a certain space of memory for this variable to be this value. When I reassigned this variable to be now this value, it didn't overwrite this value. It just created a sort of a new reference, and it reassigned our reference. So it stored this value in memory, and it also stored this value in memory. And then it said, hey, this variable, you are now going to point to this reference in memory instead of this one. So it didn't delete this one, it didn't overwrite this one, it's still there. And that's what we mean by immutable object. We will get in later on down the course when we start talking about more like software security type of things on why that is an important concept to know. But just note for now that that's what immutable objects means. Another one to note that I want to get into before we dive into wrapper classes is the term null. N-U-L-L. What does null mean? Null can be assigned to a variable, or null rather is really assigned to a variable when it is first initialized but not assigned. So what do I mean by that? I can create a string here, my null string, and just like that, I don't have to assign it to anything. Normally, we see right here, we declared our variable and initialized it and assigned it right away. Right here, we're just declaring a variable. We're not assigning it to anything. So right now, this string variable equals null. So what does null mean? Is it empty? No, it's not really empty. It's not really zero. It's not really false. It's just undefined. Kind of think of it like an artist with a brand new canvas. And someone comes up to the artist and is like, oh, that's a beautiful canvas. What color did you paint it? And the artist, looking confused, is like, well, I didn't paint it anything. There is no color to it. It's not. I didn't assign it a color. There is just no color. It's just not there. So that's kind of the same concept of null. So why do I bring that up? Well, wrapper classes, they can be set to null. So I could even literally set this to null. So this and this does the exact same thing. But what if I try and do that with an integer? My int equals null. So I'm not really getting an error right here, I think in other text editors or IDEs, again, that stands for Integrated Development Environment, which we will download one of those later on down the course. So we would use that instead of this online text editor. But either way, I think other ones may give you an error, but this one apparently doesn't. But this won't work. If we try and run this right now, we're going to see that most of these will run, but then once it gets to line 13 right here, it's going to error. Yeah, it's compile error. It wouldn't even run in the first place. So yeah, other IDEs will this is a compile error. Other IDEs will give us an error message saying, hey bro, you can't do that. And what you can't do is it's an incompatible type. You cannot assign null to an int because primitive data types cannot be null. Remember, they can only be the values themselves. But wrapper classes, they can be null, and we'll see later on throughout the course why that can be useful. So other things with wrapper classes, yeah, that's pretty much it actually. They're immutable objects, they can be set to null, and the real gist of it is they give you a bunch of features and methods and functions that we can use on a primitive data type essentially. So one that we're going to go over, and we're not going to dive into it too deep because I think it's very important that you all rather learn the importance of looking up information yourself. I know how kind of weird that sounds, that you have an instructor teaching you a programming language and then he tells you, just go research it yourself. But realistically, that's very, very important. Oh, what's going on there? Realistically, that is a very, very important part of programming is learning how and where to look for information. Because I can't sit here and teach you absolutely everything of the Java programming language. That would take, an incredible amount of time, a lot more time than just a simple Udemy course. So the power of learning how to research your own programming questions is just such an invaluable skill. It will take you a lot farther than if you were to just learn it from someone else. But anyways, continuing on. So we're going to just briefly go over the integer object here. So I'm going to delete all of this. Now, as you would expect, the integer object is a wrapper class for the primitive int data type. So we could assign it just a regular data type here. I mean, a regular integer, sorry. And as you would expect, we're going to see 5 being printed out to the screen. But now, if I try and do the dot notation, look at that. Now I actually have a bunch of functions that I can use with this primitive data type. So what are some of these ones? Max value. What does that mean? Let's see what that does. What in the world does that mean? Well, let's look on the Google to find out. I'm going to Java integer class max value. And one of the places I really love looking for documentation on Java is their Java docs, because they actually do a fairly decent job of documenting their programming language. So we're just going to search down until we find max value right here. A constant holding the maximum value an int can have. Oh, that's what max value means. So it's not the maximum value that we declared it's the maximum value of the integer. So we would then probably assume that the min value does the exact same. All right, so with the, and what we see, it prints out the minimum value, which really, if we go back to our slide deck here, that really aligns with what we saw earlier for the integer primitive data type. Because again, this integer wrapper class really just wraps around that primitive integer data type anyways. All right, so, well, what's the real value of the integer data type then? Realistically, it's not for the primitive data types themselves, but to rather you convert into or out of different primitive data types. So what do I mean by that? Let's say I have this string here of user age. For whatever reason, our program got the user's age in a string data type. Now we need to convert this string. Let's say on the birthday, we wanted to increment their age. We wanted to add 1 year to the age because that's what happens on your birthday. So I could say, I try and do a little math here. User age plus 1. Well, I have this syntax error here, invalid assignment operator. I cannot add a number 1 to a string because a string is a sentence or a word. It's not a number. So what I could do though, is let's say I wanted to print this out. And I wanted to print out the user turned, and I'll do this, that on their birthday, okay? So I could do something like that, and let's see what that looks like. So hopefully, let me try and get a little bit more spaces here. So the user turned that on their birthday. So what we really kind of want to do is do this math assignment here. Okay, and let's see what happens. Again, the user age is a string, and we're trying to add 1 to it. The user turned 281 on their birthday. No, that's not what we want, because what they're doing is they're concatenating this. They're really converting this to a string and then adding it to that. But we want this number, we want the string of 28 to be converted to a number instead. So how can we do that? Well, we can use our handy dandy integer class. I'm going to comment that out quick so we don't, it doesn't interfere with our system, our screen here. So again, we can use our handy dandy integer class. So I'm going to say integer dot, and let's look at the different functions that we have. We know that we want to use the parse int function, which will accept a argument of a string, and then the result of that is going to be an integer. That's exactly what we want. And then what is this integer, this a string that we want to pass in? Well, we want to pass in the user age. So I'm going to replace that with that. And now, instead, let me actually comment out what we were doing beforehand. Okay, let me turn this into a block comment since I do have this on multiple lines. Okay, there. So before, what we did was we wanted to try and force this math operation to happen, but it wasn't going to happen because, again, this is a string. So now, down here, we are first converting the string to an integer, and then it's going to do this math operation. So let's see what this does now. There, that's exactly what we want. The user turned 29 on their birthday, because now it's actually performing this math operation and then converts it to print out to the screen. So again, I'm not going to go over all these different functions inside the integer class. That's for you to do as your little homework and just get a better understanding of it. Same thing with the Java Boolean class. All right, you'll go search the Google and you'll come across the Java docs, read up on the Boolean class, figure out what's useful, not useful in there, or even some of these other tutorials.